Hello YouTube, Dave here again. In this video I'm going to begin ranking the official 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons hardcover campaign books that have come out from the release of 4th edition all the way through until the time that I'm recording this, which is early February of 2021. At this point, there have been 12 adventure books released, technically 13, but I will be looking at one adventure that was originally 2 books combined into 1, so that brings it down to 12. I think just for the purposes of making the videos a little bit shorter, because I do want to discuss my reasoning as best as I can for these personal rankings, that I'm going to be breaking this up into 2 parts. So this is going to be the bottom 6, so from number 12 all the way up to number 7 in terms of my personal preference, and then the next video will be 6 through 1. Now I do want to make it clear that this is just my own personal opinion. It's not meant to be like a definitive ranking system that I expect everybody to feel the same way about, and if your favorite adventure appears lower in my list of personal preferences, it's not meant to be an attack on you. It's just simply that there are things in the books that I didn't particularly care for or that just didn't appeal to what I'm looking for. So if your favorite adventures are lower in this, but they're your favorite, then that's great, because I want every one of these books to be successful, and I want every one of these to have, someone out there that absolutely loves them. Just because they didn't quite do it for me doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad or poorly done or shouldn't be explored by other people out there. So I just want to sort of get that across right away. So hopefully, people will sort of keep their comments respectful, because whenever you do personal ranking videos, it becomes a bit harrowing, because some people really take your own personal opinion very personally against them, which has never been, my intent with any of these videos. So I just want to get that out of the way. So let's go ahead and just sort of dive right into it. Now, for the purposes of doing these videos, like I said, I'm focusing on the hardcover books, so I will not be covering the starter sets, the Essentials kit, the Rick and Morty set, or the Stranger Things set. I just want to focus on the hardcover books. So starting off at number 12, we have, this is probably not going to be much of a surprise if you've been watching my channel for a while now, but at number 12, we have Waterdeep Dragon Heist. So this was a book that I was really excited about and I really wanted to love, and the more I read it, the more I really started to kind of just not despise, I think it's the wrong word, but just felt very let down or disappointed with the decisions made inside of this book. So this is sort of an adventure for characters of levels 1 through 5, and in a lot of ways it was presented as the successor to the starter set, which also had a level 1 through 5 adventure included inside. The basic premise of Waterdeep Dragon Heist is that the player characters are sort of caught up in this plot to discover the vault in which 500,000, so 500,000 gold coins have been stashed away from the city of Waterdeep's treasury by the former open lord of Waterdeep, Lord Neverember, who sort of abandoned Waterdeep to become the ruler of Neverwinter. So there's multiple factions sort of vying for this treasure, and the characters are sort of thrown into the mix. The overall premise is an interesting one, but there's a few things that I just didn't personally care about when it came to the way that this book was presented. Number 1 was just simply the level range. You have characters of levels 1 through 5 going after 500,000 gold coins, and they're coming up against a beholder, the leader, former leader of the Zentarum, the leader of a drow mercenary group, and a group of fiend-worshipping or devil-worshipping nobles. It just felt like the player characters were not, or were just too weak to be able to deal with the forces that they were up against. The adventure also is very, very railroaded in the way that things are presented. Each of the 4 factions are basically considered to be run as their own separate storyline. So when you begin the campaign as the dungeon master, you're supposed to choose which of the villains you want to use in the campaign, and then you run it based off of that information. One of the things I think was a big letdown is that it prevents the player characters from choosing which villain they sort of want to go after, or which one they feel is the biggest threat, or the one that they feel is most likely to be able to succeed. So I don't know, it just felt like a lot of missed potential there. But a lot of things happen around the players, but not because of the players. The very first encounter has a troll emerging from the pit at the Yawning Portal with this tavern, this famous tavern, with an entrance that leads to Underdark. And rather than letting the player characters fight a potentially wounded and exhausted troll, what they do is they have the bar owner just jump over the counter and ask the player characters to deal with the sturges that were chasing the troll. A much less cool or interesting way to begin the adventure. They're then approached by Volo himself to locate someone that he is trying, basically a missing friend, and he does that regardless of how well or how poorly the party does in that initial fight. Later on, the fireball goes off nearby where the player characters are, and they have to go investigate, finding out that there's this mystical tablet that has all the information that they need to find the vault with the 500,000 gold in it. However, the player characters have to then go through this ridiculous chase sequence, which is, for the most part, actually well done, with the exception of the fact that the artifact will refuse the characters the information that it contains if they obtain this thing too early. So if through their ingenuity, they're actually able to subdue the person that is trying to escape with this thing, the adventure technically punishes them for it by having this relic refuse to give them the information, try to erase their memories, and essentially set up the rest of the chase sequence, which is a bit baffling. Again, you also have high-powered NPCs who really shouldn't tolerate the player character's interference, including, Xanathar himself, leader of the Xanathar Guild. You have Manchun, the former leader of the Zentarum, or at least a clone of Manchun. You have Jarlaxle, who leads the Bragan de Arth, or I think that's how you pronounce it, but basically the Drow mercenary group, who's the most likely to actually work with the party, but is also someone who isn't above getting his hands dirty if people are constantly interfering with them. And then you have, in my opinion, the least memorable of the group, which are the Fiend Worshippers or Devil Worshippers, and I honestly can't remember their names at this point. I considered looking through it again to get all that information, but I wanted to give you the feelings that I have about this adventure still. So they were the ones that just sort of kind of fell us off to the side, with all these other much more iconic villains, sort of at the forefront. But you have situations where they might be captured by these powerful, evil NPCs who will simply just let them go, or knock them out and then dump them in an alleyway so the players can come around and interfere again. It just feels like your hand is held a bit too much, and at the end of the day, if the characters succeed and find the 500,000 gold coins, it is expected, if not almost required by the book, that they give it up and they just return it to the city. They may get some portion of the money as a reward, but you're still expecting them to go through all of that work and then just simply turn it over at the end. And if they don't, then they basically become these fugitives and the law hunts them down. And it's just, overall, it's just not the greatest example of what I would consider to be a well-done D&D adventure. There's some cool ideas. Overall, like I said, the premise is interesting, and, trying to find a way for the player characters to actually, circumnavigate around the villains, or maybe make alliances, or figure out ways to get this gold, I think would be a lot of fun. The chase sequence, like I said, is well done, but the fact that the book actively punishes the players for thinking outside the box and being able to overcome it without having to go through all 10 events in the chase sequence just really, really bothers me. So overall, for that reason, this is one of my least favorite adventures, and the one that I am probably never going to run. I have considered working on a video where I try to adjust the storyline to make it something that I might consider actually running at some point. So if you guys are interested in seeing what that process for me might be like, let me know, and that could be the subject of a future video. But for now, as it's presented, unfortunately, Waterdeep Dragon Heist is at the bottom of the list. There is some decent information about the city of Waterdeep itself, but around the same time, on DM's Guild, Wizards of the Coast released the 3rd edition Waterdeep City of Splendors book that came from the Forgotten Realms setting back then. And even the PDF copy is probably much better a purchase than getting this just for the campaign setting information. So just for all those reasons, it is number 12 on my list of 12, my personal favorite ranking of the 12 adventures to come out so far. All right, coming in at number 11, we have Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. This is just another one that as I was reading through it, I just didn't really have much of an interest in actually running it. This another one of those campaigns where the level range just doesn't feel appropriate for the characters going through it. You start off with first level characters. I believe you end with level 13, which 13 is probably done because it's supposed to be the spooky evil number sort of thing. But overall, it just didn't grab me in any way, shape, or form. It's called Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, but the plot to plunge Baldur's Gate into Avernus is disrupted pretty early on in the campaign book, and then the characters have to go into the Nine Hells to rescue the city of El Triel instead, which is a completely different city from Baldur's Gate. So I think having the Baldur's Gate name and having very little of the adventure actually take place in Baldur's Gate, or having the threat to Baldur's Gate feel a lot less important early on in the adventure, was just a bad idea overall. I think they could have just simply should have just called it Descent into Avernus, and that would have been better. You also have, low-level characters choosing to go into the Nine Hells in certain situations to, try to rescue this city, which just doesn't work. There was a comic series that came out as well. I forget the name of it off the top of my Infernal Tides. The D&D, I think it was Infernal Tides, and it actually does a much better job of getting the much higher level characters in that comic into the Nine Hells, as the city that they're in is actually plunged into the Hells as they're in it, which would have been a better setup than having the characters save one city and then go after another when they're, again, just not high enough level to deal with what's going on. The adventure itself has some interesting moments, I guess, in it. There's sort of a Mad Max feel with the way that Avernus is depicted. You've got these, infernal machines which take the place of like vehicles or motorcycles and stuff like that. That's kind of cool, but again, doesn't really work for me. It's not my cup of tea. But it is, again, sort of an interesting concept. So, if you like Mad Max and you want to run a D&D game like that, then this is probably an okay one. You're once again going up against a potential or have the opportunities to meet creatures that are such a high level, again, that they should just destroy the player characters without a second thought. You can encounter pit fiends, you can encounter demon lords, you can encounter Zerael herself throughout the course of this adventure. So I don't know. Again, it just feels like this is something that should have been done for a higher level group of characters. Have them start in Baldur and actually have Baldur's Gate sucked into the Nine Hells and have the characters just being there at the time and having to fight their way out, reaching maybe 17th level or 18th level, if not even all the way up to 20th level, because let's face it, you may be facing off against, archdevils and demon lords. So I think that would have been a better way to go about it. But overall, again, it's an interesting concept that just fails a little bit in its execution, and it just didn't do anything for me personally. So I just don't really have much of a desire to run this myself personally. But again, if this is your favorite one, there's a lot of cool things in there. It's just not what I'm personally looking for in some of these adventure books. So that's why it's at number 11. All right, coming in at number 10 is Princes of the Apocalypse. This was sort of a tough one to put in there because when this first came out, I really liked this book, and I still do. Like this is, we're sort of getting to the point where there are things about each of the following adventures that I really do want to use in my D&D campaigns. And this is one that I was actually in the process of running before ending up moving away to a different location, far enough away that I just didn't have access to my previous group of players. So the issues with this basically is that it is very dungeon crawl heavy. And I've heard some people describe it as a game of whack-a-mole. You're going up against the elemental cults. It's sort of a retelling of the original Temple of Elemental Evil adventure from way back in the days of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So you're sort of going up against the different cults, and as you clear one out, then another might pop up, and in the end, the finale of the campaign basically is just this one massive dungeon crawl with sections representing each of the four elements, and you only ever really deal with a single Prince of Elemental Evil, or Lord of Elemental Evil, whatever you want to call them, which is a bit of a shame and a bit of a disappointment, because compared to other campaigns, they're just really not that high a challenge rating. And this was a campaign meant to take the players up to 15th level. So when your like climactic campaign ending fight is against a single creature with a challenge of like 17 to 18, it's just not a big difference, and they sort of go down a little bit easy. So having a situation where you have to defeat all four of them may have been better, or having something else along those lines. But again, just a lot of dungeon crawling and a lot of situations where you think you've accomplished something and then the other cult pops up. And I don't know, it's just one of those things that, looking back at it now and knowing that most of the games that I run are being done online, I probably don't want to use a big dungeon crawl heavy adventure for my games. So for now, at least, it puts it at this point in the list. So again, interesting stuff. It's cool to see the Prince of Elemental Evil. I just would have liked to have seen them maybe better realized. Maybe have them be a little bit stronger, because you're only facing off against one really anyway. So a lot of cool stuff in there, but unfortunately just doesn't quite hold up the way that I was hoping it would after all these years. So that's why it is at number 10. Coming in at number 9 is Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Now, honestly, if I was only looking at the overall story, this would be a lot lower on the list. It probably would have been right around Waterdeep Dragon Heist in terms of how much I want to run the overall adventure. But the thing with this is that it's a book that actually takes you all the way up to 20th level. And so far, it's the only campaign that does so. But more than that, it's just a book filled with, it's a massive dungeon crawl. So I guess the question is, why is this higher on the list than Prince of the Apocalypse? It comes down mainly to the fact that each level of the dungeon can be easily taken and used as its own separate module. And that's sort of what this book more or less feels like to me, is a collection of modules. Each of the levels in the dungeon, for example, some of them mimic like natural terrains, like swamps or forests or stuff like that. So you could again easily pull them out of this book and drop them into a campaign. And being that it goes all the way up to 20th level, it gives me plenty of opportunities to cherry pick some maps or the whole level section to drop into my current game, just as something to fill the gaps if there's an opportunity to do so, in the story that I'm trying to tell. So from that perspective, this is a book that I'm more likely to use, even if it's only for bits and pieces, over running the entire campaign story itself. Honestly, I really can't tell you what the story of Dungeon of the Mad Mage is, except that the characters go into Undermountain, most likely as treasure hunters to begin with, and Halaster's bad, so you have to go and stop whatever he's trying to do. There's things about his apprentices and stuff like that in there as well, but honestly, I really can't remember too much about it. This was supposed to be a follow-up to Waterdeep Dragon Heist, but it's really a sequel sort of in location only and doesn't actually tie into any of the storylines or story threads from the Waterdeep Dragon Heist books. So I don't know. It's just, not the greatest from that perspective, but having all of these dungeon levels that could really just be a module on their own is a reason why I would probably use this book over something like Prince of the Apocalypse, even if it's only, like I said, for bits and pieces. So that's why it is at number 9. All right, coming in at number 8 is Tomb of Annihilation. This was actually a campaign that I ran, or at least ran for the most part. I do run, or at the time I was only running a monthly game, so it was just one session, like a 4-hour session, once a month. So there's only so much that you can do in a single one of those. But there's a lot of interesting aspects to this book, to this adventure, and in a lot of ways, it reminds me very much of the Isle of Dread, because you have essentially two separate concepts sort of smushed together in a way that just doesn't quite work. You have, again, your low-level characters. I believe this one goes from levels 1 through 11. So you have these first level characters exploring the cause of what's called the death curse, in which anyone who dies cannot be raised or resurrected by magic, and anyone who's been previously raised or resurrected is slowly starting to rot away or fade away as this disease takes them, and eventually if they die, their soul is again removed so that they cannot be brought back by any other means. It's an interesting concept. The players have to go to the jungles of Chult, where they have to find this lost ruins that has them exploring this large tract of land that is largely unmapped and unexplored. So you get this really cool hex crawling mechanic built into it that is a lot of fun. There's a lot of really cool locations to explore. The problem is that you don't have the time, technically, to do the hex crawling, because your contact who is, gives you the information that you need, which, by the way, the information about the death curse is an expositional dump, basically, that happens at the very opening flavor text of the campaign, rather than letting the players discover this sort of on their own, is someone who's dying from this curse, meaning that they don't have a ton of time, so there's sort of this built-in sense of, we have to keep going, we have to make this, like, basically beeline for this location. And the location can be somewhat difficult to find if the characters don't follow a very specific path to certain locations. In fact, the group that I was running through ended up really going in these basically every way except the way that would get them to where they needed to go. Eventually, they've ended up finding the information through other means, but the dungeon crawl, the hex crawling aspect was a lot of fun. The dungeon, on the other hand, was felt like a bit of a grind, and that's actually where I stopped running the module itself, shifted the characters to a different plane of existence using a relic that's inside of the book itself, and had them come back to fight the Soulmonger and deal with that at the very end, just to sort of wrap it up. But the dungeon crawling itself it felt a little bit tedious. Now, part of that, I will fully admit, is again the fact that I was running like 4-hour monthly sessions, so there was a lot of time that it was taking to get through some of the stuff. But it just, I don't know, I felt that the players were also getting a bit tired of going through the dungeon as well. There were some cool, clever traps and some, interesting things like that you sort of come across. So there were definitely some highlights. One of my favorite parts of the actual dungeon itself was some of the characters getting infected by an aboleth's mucus and having issues with that until they found a way to cleanse themselves of it or get it removed. So that was kind of cool. There's a beholder in there as well, and I love beholders, so anything involving that's going to be okay in my books. And the players actually fought the beholder and didn't do too well, which again, that was fine. But overall, it's just another example of, and this is sort of a common theme, of the characters feeling too low a level for what they're going up against. Again, you end the campaign at level 11, but you're going up against one of the most famous liches in all of D&D history, and someone who, again, wouldn't allow the characters to interfere with his plans of creating this new god by absorbing all of these souls. So realistically, once the characters start interfering even the slightest bit, you would expect him to teleport in and destroy them. And at the end of the campaign, that could happen, except it just, I don't know, it just doesn't quite work the way that I would have liked it to. And making a Serac, or however you pronounce his name, a lich or an arch-lich instead of the demi-lich that he was back in the original Tomb of Annihilation, or Tomb of Horrors, I should say. I don't know, it was just sort of an unusual decision that a lot of people felt like was a step backwards for him. I'm on the fence about that, but again, someone that should have been so much more powerful and should have just not allowed the players at level 10 or level 9 or whatever level they were at to actually be able to stop his machinations in the first place. Just, I don't know, just doesn't quite work. So you've got the hex crawling, which was great. You have the dungeon crawling, which was okay, but would have been better for higher level characters, and they just don't quite gel together. Similar, again, like I said, to what you had with the Isle of Dread, which had a big hex crawling aspect to it, but then a dungeon where it just sort of didn't quite live up to the fun and the enjoyment of all of the hex crawling. So for that reason, for the hex crawling being the best part of the book, and it introducing a new section of the Forgotten Realms, it does get a bit higher on the list, but after you reach the dungeon itself, it just kind of falls flat for me. So that's why it is at number 8. And then finally, for this video, at least coming in at number 7, we have Out of the Abyss. This was sort of another tough one to put in this video, mainly because this is an adventure that I've tried to run on a number of occasions, and other events have just sort of gotten in the way, like people's scheduling not working out, or people joining and then getting a new job, which caused them to have to drop out. And so there's just several times where I wanted to run this adventure. The overall concept with like the demon lords being unleashed in the Underdark is a really cool one. And there's one scene in particular with the Demogorgon rising from the waters, you know, in this Kuatoman village or town or whatever you want to call it. That was an amazing scene, and one that I actually did get to describe a couple of times. And it was always something that was captivating and powerful and really captured like the player's attention and gave them this sort of sense of dread. So there were some really cool aspects of it. The problem is that this was another adventure that felt like you had to follow all of the steps in order to sort of advance things. For example, when you're going through the Underdark at the very beginning of the campaign, when you escape from your cell, which again, could be done through player ingenuity, or it's also more likely that, you know, it will happen because of like the subterfuge of the drow or like the demons attacking, that the characters will end up ultimately escaping. But you have to choose an exit point. So there's like 3 different tunnels you have to choose from, but the book expects you or wants you to go to each of the different locations before you finally make it to the surface. So you can go to a Dwargar stronghold. You can go to the Kuatoman location. You can go to the Swervneblin Blinden Stone. You're also expected to drop off a Myconid back at his home in this grove. There's all these different locations that the book kind of wants you to go to before you actually make it to the surface, which is okay to an extent, but you know, one of the things that I found was that the players were really more interested in just getting themselves out of the Underdark rather than trying to help all of these other Underdark creatures get to their homes, per se. So I don't know, it just didn't quite feel right from that. And then the second that the players leave the Underdark partway through the adventure, they're essentially almost immediately called back by Brunor Battlehammer to go back into the Underdark and find out why the Demon Lords are there and find a way to get rid of them. So it's just like, what was the point in even escaping to the surface in the first place if you're just asking the players to go right back into it? I don't know, it's just something that didn't quite sit well with me from that perspective, but there is a lot of cool stuff in this book. First of all, you get sort of a regional source book for the Underdark. So this gives you like locations like Menzo Berenzin, Blindenstone, the Grackle Steel, or whatever it's called, the Dwargar Outpost. So it gives you a lot of cool locations to explore and information about the Underdark that makes for an awesome set of rules to use in a campaign. If your characters get stuck in there, or if you just wanted to run an Underdark exploration campaign, you can do that, and it's great, and there's a lot of cool stuff from that perspective. Again, the adventure, it just seems to keep forcing the player characters into the Underdark, even if there's no real reason for them to be the ones to do it in the first place. And I don't know, it bothered me again, like just from that perspective. But I will say, the one thing that I really love about this adventure is the final climactic scene in which the Demon Lords just basically have this giant brawl, with the player characters being able to take control of the different Demon Lords as they're just beating the crap out of one another. So you can have the players engage in PvP, but not have it actually affect their characters. which is good. So hopefully you won't have any hard feelings carrying over if someone ends up defeating the other player's Demon Lord or whatever, before Demogorgon appears and sort of puts an end to everything, and then the characters go after him to sort of finish everything off. So there's a lot of good in here. It's just a little bit railroady, but definitely not as bad as, say, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, but it would have been nice to have had some options for the characters to do stuff on the surface, where they learned that the presence of the Demon Lords is having a corrupting effect on surface settlements, to the point where they might feel obligated to try to put an end to it, knowing sort of roughly where it's concentrated in. So I think that would have been a better approach than just, oh, you made it to the surface, well, now you're called for an audience with the Dwarven King, who asked you to go right back down. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more maybe from that perspective, or even just have some options listed if the players wanted to take that route. But, you know, overall, this is definitely a decent adventure, and one that I would absolutely run to this day. I would just make some modifications to it, but you know, it's definitely worth checking out. And again, it's a nice regional source book for the Underdark, similar to how Tomb of Annihilation was a great resource book for the location of Cholt. And so yeah, it's definitely good from that perspective as well, but didn't quite crack the top 6, so it didn't quite make it to the top half of the list, unfortunately, in this situation. So that's actually going to take care of this first video. Like I said, I wanted to spend some time talking about each of the adventures and my thoughts and feelings towards them. So I didn't want to make another hour-long video. I think splitting into two might be a little bit easier. So we'll hopefully come back for the second part, the follow-up, where we go through numbers 6 through 1. Which are basically, you know, the campaigns that I would absolutely love to run, or books that I absolutely would love to use in my current D&D campaign. So let me know in the comments below, based on the 12 storylines that have come out so far to date, which are your favorite, or how would you rank your bottom 6 of the 12, and let me know that in the comments below. And again, you know, if you have fond memories of these adventures, that's awesome as well. Like, I'm not trying to say that these are bad and that you shouldn't like them. They just didn't quite work for me for whatever reason. But if you played through them and you wanted to share some of your stories on these campaigns, please feel free to do that in the comments below as well, because I always love to hear the experiences that you guys have had at your gaming tables, because they always make for awesome stories. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and please come back for part 2, where I look at the top 6 adventures next time. So again, until that video, thank you again for watching. Take care.